All right, let's take a closer look at some of the stories that have caught our eye in Behind the Headlines. The Washington Post reports on one of our main stories. French President Emmanuel Macron has asked Rwandans to forgive France for its role in the 1994 genocide. The Evening Standard has more on the Manchester United footballer Marcus Rashford, who faced an avalanche of racist comments after his team lost their Europa Cup final a few days ago. The Times has more on the growing calls for the Tokyo Olympics to be called off due to coronavirus fears. Locals have voted against what they fear could turn into a super spreader event. The Times reports that one of the game's sponsors is now calling for a cancellation. And the phrase, the one where, can only be the Friends or Friends. The global phenomenon is back after a break of 17 years. Le Parisien reports on the one-off episode that is being called The Reunion, which has fans drooling. Now, my reviewers today are the broadcaster and journalist Lape Olorunnoya and political campaigner Mike Buckley. Thanks to you both for joining us on the programme. Lape, if I could start with you, what do you make of the French president's words about his country's role in the Rwandan genocide? He didn't say sorry. He said France was not an accomplice and he asked for forgiveness.
Well, it's actually almost an evolution of what we've been seeing from France, the rhetoric surrounding the Rwandan genocide that we've been seeing from France. If we look at the predecessors of Mr. Macron, have been very careful in the way in which they use language. We know Francois Hollande didn't actually accept responsibility. He stated that France was complicit but weren't completely responsible, and certainly did not ask for forgiveness. But we see that evolve now in the sense where President Macron, who is in Rwanda, has asked for forgiveness and has expressed the position that France played leading up to the Rwandan genocide. And it's all particularly because of Francois Mitterrand, who was the former president of France during the administration which led to the Rwandan genocide. So it's interesting to see the way in which different French presidents are changing the use of their language when addressing this horrible history in Rwanda.
Yeah, I mean, Mike, do you think supporting a genocidal regime or a failure to act, does it equal complicity in the crime itself?
I'm not sure if it equals complicity. And I think that I agree, though, that Macron used his words very, very carefully. I'll be honest, I don't know enough of the detail to know whether France was complicit or not. But what I do know, and I did some work quite a long time ago with refugees who were in Uganda who'd come over from Rwanda after the genocide. So I do know something of which I speak. But the impression I get is that it wasn't just France that didn't act. The whole international community watched what was happening and took a long time to act. And I was just reading today that the genocide really happened in April and France didn't act until June. And that's a very, very long time when there are effectively butchers who are killing. I mean, they killed 800,000 people. It's absolutely shocking. But it's not just France that didn't act. It's also the US. It's also the UK. It's the international community more broadly that watched this genocide take place, stood back, and then very, very belatedly intervened. I think with France, there is the distinction that because it supported the regime, because it knew that it was a problematic regime, maybe there were things that France knew or could have done prior to the event, which maybe other governments, wouldn't have known about. So it may be that France bears more responsibility, but without having seen the documents, which I think are beginning to be made available by the French government, that certainly isn't for me to say categorically.
OK, I mean, if we're moving on to racism... oh, yeah, sure, Lape, just... Please,
I just wanted to add very quickly there, just onto what Mike was saying. I think the role that France played, yes, other countries within the international community also sat back and watched, but actually France was responsible for funding arms and in the form of weaponry and in the form of men. Actually, they increased the size of the Rwandan army just before the genocide almost by double, which is why there's so much of a spotlight on France with its involvement. And also, just to add on to that, the relationship between the presidents at the time, the French president as well as the Rwandan president, was very cordial, which is why the world thought that France had a huge part to play.
Sure, yeah. I mean, a significant statement from Macron today. If we're moving on to racism in football, Marcus Rashford is the latest to suffer online abuse, more than 70 racial slurs. Mike, why is it so hard for the social media giants like, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, to stamp out online abuse?
It isn't hard, and we know full well that they can do it because they've done it before. I mean, they pulled Donald Trump's accounts very, very quickly when they decided that was going to be in their interest. So when they decide that something works for them, is in their interest, they can do it, whatever it is. They've got access to all the data, all the tools, which are far more complicated and in-depth than certainly I know or understand, but certainly from work I do in political campaigns, I know that very, very clear and specific and targeted tools are available to work out who is posting what, where it comes from, which accounts are involved, which networks are involved, and then they can be shut down. So the social networks are choosing not to act on this. However, one thing I do want to say is that football as a whole has done an incredible job of rooting out racism within its ranks. So I realise that what's happened to Marcus Rashford and I think other Manchester United players in the last 24 hours has been, very bad. But as a whole, football actually is, as I understand, as a sport, has done a great job of rooting out racism amongst its supporters and within its ranks. So there's much to be commended in the football community, even though there are, of course, things like that happen like this, which are still, very, very bad.
Sure. I mean, do you think, Lape, that the authorities are doing enough? I mean, would harsher sentencing or tougher penalties for people found guilty of this sort of abuse, would that be a deterrent? Because if you were to say things like this to someone in the office or the playground or on the playing field, it's a crime, and in some cases it can be a hate crime.
Oh, well, no, I don't. In answer to your question, I don't think they're doing enough. I mean, only recently, and I don't know if I've got this down to the T, but only recently did they, the football community, the sporting community, come out and say that if you say something that's anti-Semitic, you got a significant ban. I think it was up to 10 years. Don't quote me on that, but there was a significant repercussion for that. But now, if we look at the way in which the sporting community, particularly football, has dealt with the treatment of especially black football players, yes, they've addressed it, and yes, they've brought it to light and raised the awareness, but there's not a lot of punitive measures in place. I mean, taking the knee raises awareness, but actually what happens next? And many black footballers have come out to say that, there needs to be some sort of a long-term goal with addressing racism, and particularly because majority of football is quite diverse. There's a people from very, very different backgrounds, so it's very ironic to see that the fans are being racist, and I think there needs to be a lot more stronger consequential repercussions as a result of this. It's all well and good reporting it, but what happens after it's been reported? Are people prosecuted? We haven't seen that happen, in its masses, and I think that's really what needs to take place. So the authorities have, there's a lot of room for improvement there.
I want to stay on sport and go to the Tokyo Olympics. Mike, in favour or not of the Olympics going ahead?
I think if it was my call, I think I would cancel them. But it isn't my call. But you look at the infection rates in Japan, and you look at the fact that we're still very much in the midst of a global pandemic. Some people would like the pandemic to be over. We'd all like it to be over, but the reality is that it's not over. It's absolutely ongoing. So were it my call, I would cancel them. The sad thing with that is all the athletes.
I mean, the Japanese don't sound like they even want it to go ahead.
No, they don't. They're desperate for it not to. I mean, 70% of them, I think, don't want it to go ahead. It may be higher now. Because understandably, they fear a super spreader event. They've watched some of their friends and family die from this virus, and others become very ill, just as in every other nation. What they don't want is thousands and thousands of people, because it's not just the athletes, it's their support teams as well, flying into Japan and potentially, bringing variants with them, or just spreading the virus, with the existing variants. But, they're busy in lockdown now trying to contain this virus, and suddenly to import it. But the worrying thing for Tokyo and for Japan is that it's the International Olympic Committee, which makes most of its money from these events, which makes the call on whether to cancel it or not. It's very, very expensive for Japan to choose to do that itself. It will cost them billions. So in all likelihood, these events will go ahead because it's in the financial interest of the IOC to make it happen, which is very worrying. If I was Japanese, I would be very concerned about that fact.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much money riding on these sort of big sporting events, but it does seem like total madness, doesn't it, Lape? I mean, everybody seems to be able to see it, except for the IOC. I mean, do you think it can be done responsibly?
I mean, it's that question, how long is a piece of thread? I mean, yes, it can be done responsibly, but at what cost? And at the cost of Japanese healthcare, the Japanese people that have been so, careful in the way in which they mix and have sacrificed so much just to return back to some form of normality. They could have that all taken away from them if, this risk is taken. And it's that debate over, the economy versus, people's lives and health and public health. And I think that's a debate that the whole world has had to have across different countries. But in this case, a sporting event where the repercussions could be extremely detrimental. It's really, it's not room. There's no room for debate there, really, is there? And the fact
Yeah,
that
I suppose. I mean, Mike, other sporting events have gone ahead. Here in the UK, we've had up to 10,000 fans that have been allowed into stadiums as part of coronavirus trials. They seem to have gone rather successfully. Can this not be done in a similar way?
No, because of all the travel involved. I mean, you'll be bringing in people. You will be bringing in new variants because the virus is mutating all the time, and you'll be creating an environment in which the virus will be spreading. Variant will impact upon variant. I think that will create new variants. We're potentially risking lives in Japan and lives, of course, far afield as well, because people will be there. Some of them will become ill, then they will go home again, and the virus will be transferred. So it's completely different. However, the trials that took place in the UK were also highly irresponsible. I think most of the people in those events were young people who hadn't been vaccinated. Yes, it's a trial, but it was a trial where their lives are being put at risk, and that shouldn't have happened.
Sure. OK, understood. Well, moving on to this Friends reunion episode. Either of you fans of the Friends series? I mean, it was a global phenomenon. Anyone want to take this one? Lape, did you watch Friends? Will you be watching the reunion?
I did watch Friends growing up. I wasn't I'm not a super fan, but I was an avid watcher of the series, and I think it's a bit of a killjoy having. I mean, people will slander me for this. I mean, but it is a bit of a killjoy having it back. But I think the way in which it's been structured, where it's a sit-down interview where they kind of go through, the memories. They have remakes of little bits and pieces. They're on the set where it was filmed. It's nostalgic for them, and it's this, having to have the opportunity as a viewer to relive that vicariously through them. I think that's the beauty of this. And I think a lot of super fans, not like me, are very keen and are going to be keeping their eyes peeled later on today to see how this all comes together. I'm sure there'll be lots of emotion as well.
I mean, it was just so successful right across the world. Mike, why do you think it was a phenomenon across so many different languages and so many different cultures? Why did it resonate with people?
I think partly lightning struck. I mean, you had an almost perfect cast. It was incredibly well written for 10 years. It was constantly funny. I haven't seen all the episodes by any stretch of the imagination, but I've never seen an episode that I didn't enjoy, and at least smile or laugh out once. So it was, the consistency of quality was just astounding, and that was as much to do with the actors and their ability as it was the writing.
As the sort of writing. I mean, Lape, it wasn't very diverse, though, was it?
No, it wasn't. But the diversity is a conversation that we're only really starting to address and enforce at the moment. So at the time, I think many people focused on the chemistry between the young cast and the fact that it was universally funny. Like you've just said, I mean, people all over the world got the joke. It wasn't just restricted to an American audience. And I think that was the beauty of it. I think now time has passed. We've been talking a lot more about diversity and representation. And if it was filmed now, of course, it probably wouldn't look the same. But I think it's a classic and people love it for its humor and the way in which the cast were able to really have a really strong rapport.
All right, well, it's playing on HBO if either of you want to tune in to the reunion episode. But I want to thank both of my reviewers today, the broadcaster and journalist Lape Olorunnoya and political campaigner Mike Buckley. Thanks to both of you. That's been this edition of Behind the Headlines.